it's now time for us to leave the podium here, metaphorically speaking, and start with the section fiction Italian authors backing the tide. And I would like to call Michael Reynolds, Maria Leonardi, Paolo Zaninoni, Chad Post, and Tina Jordan at the podium.
Again, I want to thank the Italian Trade Commission for hosting AAP at the Turin Book Fair. I had the pleasure of stopping by in Rome to learn that the most amazing Colosseum that is obviously in Rome was built in 8 years. So I truly hope that there are Italians behind the renovation of the Javits Center, so they'll finish it quickly.
All right, this happens at all sales conventions that we have, so it's perfectly regular experience. Talking about trends, I think it's probably correct to sort of phrase the question the other way around. I don't think there are trends in Italy that translate into trends in the US, not yet. But there are certainly things happening that have been happening internationally, I should say, and not just in Italy. Italy is just a part of a larger scenario there. From my perspective, which is the perspective of a trade publisher involved in fiction and nonfiction, that are having an impact here. And I think the category that I should mention is the one of genre. I think that it's evident to everybody that in the last years, books have surfaced in the American market, in the American trade market, that have come from abroad, that have been remarked with a lot of attention, that have sold widely. And I would say that the most significant of those are books that originate from other countries, but that are mostly in the domain that I would call crime fiction and genre fiction, which is a bit of a departure. We've been probably learning a lot from you guys. I mean, our writers have, they've started to write in this, globalize the language of crime fiction, and it's sort of working as an introduction, crime fiction being, in Europe at least, much more socially and politically conscious than in the US. As of average, as an introduction to what our current state of affairs is like, and to the culture and to the politics of the countries that gets portrayed. Nothing new there, except that in the past, I would say more often than not, this would be done by English language authors. Now it's done by local authors that get translated. And I need not quote Stieg Larsson as the one that broke the ice, but he seems to have broken the ice for a lot of other countries, and for Italy, among them. So that's one trend that I would define as sort of contributed to changing the rules of the game. The other trend, to put it very briefly, is not a genre, is not a literary category, is the breed of mega sellers. The market is polarizing in Italy and in Europe as it is here. We're talking about the death of the mid-list in Italy, as publishers are in this country. So we seem to be having more books that break out in a very big way, in a colossal way, really, books that sell 300,000, 400,000, 500,000, 1 million copies by Italian authors. This was hardly the case up to a few years ago. And these books become automatically visible, conspicuous, and interesting for the rest of the world. And that also, I think, defines a category of what I call, to some extent, globalized fiction, although it may not, mean that the two categories overlap or can be confused for each other. So yes, there are changes. I think one is called, the birth of international genre fiction, and the other one is the birth of the local megaseller that, by the fact itself of its being a megaseller, European megaseller, Italian megaseller, becomes automatically interesting for a translation market. And it's probably what's contributing to a certain hyperactivity in the sales of foreign rights, which we've also been a part of, that Marco has reported on very accurately, we are now fielding requests and offers at Rizzoli, as at all major Italian publishing houses, from the US and the English language world. That is probably in the last 2 or 3 years above the notorious 3% or 3.7% that we've come to experience in decades now. And that's also new. It's happening now. And I hope, and we hope, that it's going to continue. There are 2 ways of riding the wave. The first is probably to become more professional, to invest more in foreign rights offices and foreign rights people who are actually, in the know of the trade. The other one is to probably cooperate more with a new phenomenon in Italy, that is the phenomenon of literary agents that just didn't used to be there. They're now there. They're working professionally, and they can cooperate very efficiently with publishers on the foreign market side. The other way is for a publisher who wants to be active here to set up their own operation in this country, and that has famously occurred with Europa Editions. It's also happened, and it's happening more with Rizzoli, which has had its own operation in the US for decades now, called Rizzoli International Publishing. Rizzoli International Publishing has done a very specific work of publishing and promoting illustrated books, art books, lifestyle books. So it's carved out a very specific niche. But in the last 2-3 years, jointly, we have worked towards establishing an operation within Rizzoli International Publishing, a specific list that is called Ex Libris, that's devoted almost exclusively to the publication of Italian fiction and non-fiction which may have an interest for the US market. It's an activity that has been going on for a couple of years sporadically. It's now taking a new speed this fall with the publication, and it's an interesting small selection, I think, in terms of the market, of an autobiography by Maestro Riccardo Muti, so Italian music at its best, an expose of the current state of Italian affairs by Beppe Severnini, who's been probably one of the last Italian authors to make the bestseller list in this country in the last years, with a book published by Broadway originally, and with a crime novel by Italian best-selling author Gianrico Carofiglio, who's based in Bari and writes very socially, politically conscious crime novels set in the Italian South. And that's also, I think, a very interesting development, not just, the sale of rights, but the actual participation, direct participation in the market that, as we know, can lead to very interesting outcomes.
Well, I'm going to ask Michael to sort of take it from there. I don't think this is on. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. Particularly in the context of how Italian publishers can leverage their mid-list authors to the international market, and as well as making the international market aware of the domestic mega bestsellers.
Thank you. Before I start, I just wanted to mention our colleague, Maria Leonardi, who was supposed to be here today. She works at the Italian publisher Nottetempo, a very fine publisher, and I'll mention the context in which Nottetempo is placed in the Italian editorial world. Unfortunately, Maria couldn't be here, and we do have an author in common with Europa Editions. We published one of their best-selling authors, Milena August, a couple of years ago. Milena August's book and the phenomena of her book also fits with some things that I'll mention later on, so we'll get back to Nottetempo. In the meantime, I just wanted to wish Maria well, because she's not too well at the moment. In terms of real authentic literary trends in Italy today, in this moment, I'm not sure that there is any particular trend in terms of writers' input, but having said that, there are lots of interesting things happening. I do think that there's a lot of media hype and publisher hype around new writers particularly, and they do tend to market their writers, we tend to market our writers by creating some sort of buzz around those authors, and in some cases inventing or adding to the to the buzz around a particular trend. At the moment, just a couple of weeks ago, I believe there was a conference held, organized by La Terza, publisher in Italy, trying to identify the characteristics of a new generation of writers that they're calling the TQ. TQ standing for 30-40, so 30, 40-year-old writers. And there were various different efforts to sort of identify who these writers are and what the characteristics of their writing is. As I said, I think it might be a little bit forced, this kind of movement. A few years back, one interesting trend, I think, was probably the new Italian epic, a terminology that was identified, that was first used by Wu Ming-wan, I think, is that right? In describing a particular kind of Italian novel. Some of the novels that fit into that category were the Ottava Vibrazione by Lucarelli, Gomorra by Saviano, Wu Ming-wan's own novel. And in some ways, I think these two trends, or these two attempts to identify a trend, in some ways indicate perhaps that there's not so much a movement away from the genre fiction, but in some ways literary fiction reasserting itself. Certainly 5 or 6 years ago in Italy and in much of Europe, the market was very much dominated by the crime novel. And I think that trend is changing slightly. I believe that the crime novel is still very important. It has a very important, certain type of crime novel has a very important social role, political role also in Italy and in many other countries in Europe. It's great entertainment and it's still immensely popular. But I don't see it quite as dominant as it was maybe 4 or 5 years ago at the moment. One important trend that I wouldn't so much say is necessarily a literary trend, but an editorial trend, is the hunt, the at times exaggerated hunt for young debut authors. This probably is prompted by a couple of different factors. Perhaps one of them is the proliferation of small and medium-sized publishing realities in Italy at the moment, and obviously the purview of smaller publishers is to go out and look for untapped talent. And there are a lot, as there are almost everywhere else, as the means of creating books is changing and becoming more accessible. There are a lot of young, new, dynamic publishers in Italy, which is a good thing, a very good thing. Perhaps another reason for the hunt for young writers, perhaps culture in general is skewing younger in Italy at the moment, which again is a very positive thing. I think culture, at least in terms of its institutional definition, has been in the hands of the elderly for a long time in Italy. So any loosening of that grip is once again a good thing. And probably most of all, the thing that has contributed to this trend towards debut authors in Italy is the success of several important authors. I might mention Alessandro Piperno, whose first novel was an enormous success. Valeria Parrella, also the Minimum Fax author, who, when she published with Minimum Fax, was nominated for the Strega. And probably most importantly, the book of, I can go back again to Nottetempo, Milena August's Mal di Pietra, was also an enormous international success. But perhaps what has contributed most to this is the success of Paolo Giordano's book, The Solitude of Prime Numbers, which was published here by Penguin, right, by Penguin, yes, which was in Europe a phenomenon. A couple of months back I did a panel in Rome about bestsellers that had been by Italian writers or by European writers, and Paolo Giordano just blew everybody else away at that time. So I think all of these things has contributed to a focus on debut authors, on young authors in Italy, and this is a positive thing. even if at times that attempt to find and publish debut authors may be a little hasty, perhaps, the publication, because it is, at the moment, everybody is looking for the next big thing. Some names I suppose I would like to mention in this context, some names. I'm not sure why exactly everybody is here, but I thought I might mention some names of authors who fit into one or more of these categories that I've just mentioned, who are not yet published in the English language market, who I think are deserving of publication. Each of these authors present certain difficulties for publication in the English language. Otherwise, we would have published them, obviously. But they are very deserving authors and important authors. One of them is Nicola La Gioia, who I think is an extraordinarily talented young author. And his most recent book, Fernaudi, was brilliant. It was really a wonderful novel. One of the thinkers and novelists and writers, journalists that I most admire in Italy at the moment is Antonio Scurati, who's another author who hasn't yet been published in English. At the parent company of Europa Editions, we recently published a debut author. Her name is Viola De Grado, who's currently in the running. I think she's still in the running for the Strega Prize this year. Antonio Pascale is another author whom I think is really an extraordinary voice in Italian fiction. In some ways, I think he symbolizes something that has happened here, and perhaps Valeria Parella, and kudos to the people at Minimum Facts, because both authors have been published by Minimum Facts. I think they've been great at identifying writers who have a very distinct voice. You read a sentence of both of these authors and you know exactly who it's from. And this is not true of all Italian authors. I think the general take-home message that I'd like to make, I'm not sure if I've answered your question at all, Tina, but the take-home message I'd like to make is there is enormous flourishing of publishing realities in Italy at the moment. And some of the most interesting work, not to take anything away from my colleagues here today, some of the most interesting editorial work is happening with small and mid-sized publishers. To know what is happening with those small and mid-sized publishers, there are several really good contexts for learning what's happening at the moment, including the Turin Book Fair and the Rome Book Fair, which is now in its 6th or 7th year, I can't remember. Rome in particular, which focuses on small and mid-sized publishing in Italy, is supremely interesting to anyone interested in what's happening with those smaller and mid-sized publishers in Italy at the moment. I think that's all I have to say.
Thank you, Michael. Well, you know, based on some of the data that we saw this morning, I'm going to urge Chad to change his publishing house name to 4% Press. But just to pick up on where Michael left off, noting that that literary fiction is reasserting itself, and that the crime novel, while still obviously very popular, there's different, you know, there's a much more expanding opportunity as it relates to fiction. And finally, the hunt for debut authors. Chad, from your purview, what have you seen both in that context as well as the overarching context for translations?
Well, is this on? You guys can hear me, right? Okay. Well, what I'm going to say pretty much is very boring compared to the other two speakers, so I'll try and keep this short and quick and to the point. The press I run is called Open Letter and does only literature and translation. We have a website called 3% that we started as like a blog and review source to try and help create a community for people who are interested in international literature. And as part of this, we named it 3% because this has been a long-standing sort of mythical figure of that all the books published in America, 3% are works in translation. So we chose that name and kind of ran with it for a while and promoted that sort of statistic. And then one time I was at a panel similar to this with Elliot Weinberger, and he was talking to me about the books that are published in translation. He's like, that 3% number is total bullshit. He's like, it's less than 1% if you're lucky. Like, there are not that many books that are published in translation in America, especially not in fiction and poetry. So I decided that we'd create like a little database and keep track of everything that we could. And so we had to set certain like limits. And the limits we set were that we would only look at original works of fiction and of poetry that were being published in the U.S. So no retranslations, no works of nonfiction, no children's books, just young adult and older works of fiction and poetry that have never appeared to American readers before. So we started punching in all these numbers, talked to everyone we could, went through every catalog website, blah, 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 and started creating numbers. And as it turns out, like the 3% thing is sort of not true. And I think the statistic came out last week was that there were 300,000 books that were published, traditional books that were published in America this past year, and like 2.9 million non-traditional books, which is ridiculous, and the whole thing's like insane. So out of these 3.3 million books or whatever, 3% of those are not in translation. But looking at fiction and poetry, there's usually about 50,000 that come out every year in America, new titles, and of that, approximately 350 are works in translation. So just to run off some quick numbers, and then I'll get to my point. In 2008, there were 278 works of new fiction and 81 poetry books. 2009, that number went up slightly to 285 works of fiction and 72 poetry books. 2010, 252 books, a big drop because of the recession, and 75 works of poetry. And this year, I have 183 so far, but that's kind of crap. Now, the thing that's interesting for here, first of all, for Italy, is that Italy has been very static in a sense, which is kind of interesting. Initially in 2008, because I keep all this information like the titles, the publisher, the language, the country of origin, translator, so on and so forth, so we can break everything down. In 2008, Italy was way down the list in terms of languages translated. It was French with 60, then Spanish, German, Arabic, Japanese, Russian, Portuguese, and then Italian with 14 original books that came out in 2008. In 2009, Italy went up to the 5th position behind Spanish, French, German, Arabic, with 22 titles, which isn't that much higher. And that was an anomalous year, I think. And then 2010, staying in the top 5, there's French, Spanish, German, Japanese, and Italian with 15 books. Now, the thing that's interesting that echoes what Michael is saying is that here in America, like most of the books, we tend to think of everything in terms of like the big 5-6 publishers. But when it comes to translations, most of the stuff is coming out from smaller presses and mid-sized presses, independent presses, university presses, so on and so forth. So looking at this a little bit closer for people who are interested in figuring out what's going on with getting Italian books published in America, or where to find out about Italian fiction, if you look at it, Europa, like, far and away kicks everyone's ass. So in like 2008, out of those 14 books, Europa did 5 of them. In 2009, out of the 22, Europa did 6. In 2010, out of the 15, they did 4. And the other presses that are in there is there's always like one book coming out of FSG or 2, a couple from Bitter Lemon, which echoes the crime sometime earlier, one from Penguin, one from Melville House, one from Random House, one from Yale. But generally, it tends to be these smaller presses that are doing these sort of books. So I guess the only point that I have is that the trends that I've seen are there are a lot of crime books that come out from these places, but the more literary fiction is coming from Europa and from other presses that are smaller, more geared towards that. So in terms of from the American side, if you're exporting stuff to America, you should start with those level of presses if you want some success. And Italy has room to grow. I mean, the French have 60 books coming out in 2010, and Italy is 1/4 of that. So I think there's a lot of space, and I think the things that are going on with the Chicago office, with the Turin Book Fair, Rome Book Fair, are going to help change that situation over time, especially by matching up Italian publishers with smaller U.S. presses.
Well, thank you to our panelists, and I'm sure they'll make themselves available afterwards if there are additional questions.